Death at Whitechapel, Chapter 3, 11th of April, 1898, Marlborough House. My dear Winston, I cannot resist writing a few lines to congratulate you on the success of your book. I have read it with the greatest possible interest, and I think the descriptions and the language generally excellent. Everybody is reading it. I only hear it spoken of with praise. Having now seen active service, you will wish to see more, and have as great a chance, I am sure, of winning the V.C. as Fincastle had. And I hope you will not follow the example of the latter, who I regret to say intends leaving the army in order to go into Parliament. You have plenty of time before you, and should certainly stick to the army before adding MP to your name. Hoping that you are flourishing, I am, yours very sincerely, A.E. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. The dining room at Sibley House was as large and as bleak as a cave, but Kate had screened off an area near the fireplace and had a table for 7 arranged there. Their guests were Lady Randolph and her companion, a handsome, young, very young, lieutenant of the Scots Guards named George Cornwallis West, Manfred Raeburn, the managing editor of Jenny's magazine, Mr. Raeburn's vivacious and thoroughly modern sister Maud, who had recently returned from a walking tour of Italy and Greece, and Winston. The staff at Sibley House was so excellently trained that Kate gave scarcely a thought to the mechanics of dinner. Elegant dishes appeared and disappeared, and fine wines were poured with a flourish, while sparkling conversation ebbed and flowed the length of the intimate table. The only difficulty that Kate could see was a marked coldness between Winston and Mr. Raeburn, a respectable man who had apparently been in his regiment, and a definite stiffness between Winston and Lieutenant Cornwallis West. Kate understood perfectly well what that was about, because the young guardsman, who was almost exactly Winston's age, was Lady Randolph's current affaire du coeur. Lady Randolph, her dark beauty emphasized by her pale green satin gown, quite décolletée, was a stunningly attractive woman who always had a quatuor of men at her heels, usually younger men. The rumors about her relationship with the gallant and self-assured guardsman had been flying wildly about London all throughout the summer, even finding their way into the newspapers. Kate put Winston's aloofness down to jealousy, for it was very obvious from the way he looked at his mother that he was extraordinarily attached to Jenny and not a little possessive. The women made their usual departure after dinner, Kate leading them to the smallest of the 3 drawing rooms, where fresh flowers from the conservatory scented the air, and coffee and liquors were arranged on the table in front of the fire. Mrs. Raeburn excused herself to freshen up, and Kate and Lady Randolph were left alone. Kate leaned back in her chair, wishing that she were an artist and might sketch this beautiful woman with the enigmatic eyes. "I'm so glad to get to know you better, Lady Randolph." "I should like to call you Kate," Lady Randolph said decidedly, "and I wish you would call me Jenny." She returned Kate's smile and lowered her voice confidentially. "After all, we're both Americans, married into English families. We both know how difficult that can be." She paused. "And you already know that I am a great admirer of Belle Bardwell. I have read all her work." "Thank you," Kate said, although she doubted that Jenny Churchill knew everything she had written. Back in New York, where she had supported herself entirely with her pen, Kate had produced whatever she could sell, mostly sensational penny dreadfuls with titles like Missing Pearl and the Daughter's Deadly Revenge for Frank Leslie's month magazine. She wasn't ashamed of the work, for it had put food on the table and a roof over her head, and had taught her a good bit into the bargain. But the surprising inheritance that had delivered her from writing for a living now allowed her to write as she chose. While her recent work still belonged more or less to the popular genre of detective fiction, it was far more psychologically inclined, a deeper exploration of motive and mood. Kate was especially interested in portraying strong and self-willed women who made their own way into the world, sometimes becoming victims of their own ambition, sometimes becoming villains, sometimes heroines. Strong-willed, forthright women who managed their own affairs, knew their own minds, and followed their own hearts. Women like Jenny Churchill, and hence Kate's interest in her guest. "Perhaps," Jenny said, "you would consider writing a story for the first issue of my new literary venture. I should very much like to have your advice and counsel on the magazine itself." "Mine?" Kate asked in surprise. "But I thought that Mr. Raeburn—" Mr. Rayburn, Jenny said firmly, is experienced in the technical and financial aspects of publishing, but I need someone who knows the literary scene and can help me make an editorial plan for the first 4 issues. Her dark eyes were intense, her face passionate. I have such dreams for the magazine, Kate. My life has grown meaningless these past 2 years. I sometimes think that all I have to look forward to is an endless parade of country house parties, dinners, and balls. She leaned forward. The magazine can change all that. It will give my life direction. More than that, it will have an influence on the way people think. I quite agree, Kate said. If I can help in any way, please do call on me. Wonderful, Jenny exclaimed. Perhaps then we might spend several mornings next week discussing what might be done. I'm sorry, Kate said. I'm leaving for the country tomorrow. At Jenny's crestfallen look, she added, but I should be very pleased if you would come to stay with me at Bishop's Keep. Charles will be at Somersworth, and I have only a few little projects to keep me occupied. Please come by whenever you like. It was true that Kate had only a few projects currently in hand, but one of them was hardly little. Her school for the useful arts had created quite a controversy in the neighborhood, especially among certain local churchmen who considered public education their prerogative, and she was going to have to deal with the problem. But that shouldn't occupy all of her time. We can be quite alone, she went on, and walk in the garden and drive to the village and talk to our heart's content, if you wouldn't find it all too boring, she smiled. I'm afraid there's no society to speak of, and we are very quiet. No society, Jenny clapped her hands delightedly. Oh, Kate, it sounds delightful. No parties, no balls, no silly chatter, just quiet talks and evenings before the fire. I shall come whenever it is convenient for you. At that point, Mrs. Rayburn entered the room and turned the conversation to her recent extended tour of the Mediterranean countries. It was nearly 20 minutes before she drew a breath, and Kate would suggest that they join the men in the library. So, Winston, I hear that you are bound for India again. You'll be rejoining the 4th, will you? Charles sat down in the wing chair with his snifter of brandy and crossed his legs. Rayburn and Cornwallis West had detached themselves and were engaged in an animated discussion by the fire, the topic of which seemed to be stag shooting in Scotland. Actually, Charles thought this was rather a relief. Though he seldom noticed such things, the tension between Winston and the 2 other men had been quite evident at dinner. Winston obviously resented the young guardsman's attention to his mother, and had turned a noticeable cold shoulder to Rayburn, in spite of the fact that they'd been at Aldershot together. Yes, after the first of the year, Winston said, accepting a cigar from the butler and folding himself into a chair opposite. I departed India so precipitously that I left quite a few loose ends, he grinned in boyish pleasure, although I must admit that it is less India that summoned me than the interregimental tournament. Ah, polo, Charles said, tilting his glass. The Emperor of Games. The game in which so many British officers in India spent their idle hours, their long idle hours. Is the tournament ground still at Meerut? Indeed, Winston said, still stirrup deep in red dust. And Sir Pertap Singh is still regent of Jodhpur? To be sure, you know him then. Charles nodded. Give him my regard, will you? He himself had returned to India after a battle to tie up loose ends, but that had been a long time ago. He changed the subject. I understand that you are writing another book. Yes, The War for the Waterway, Winston replied. It is much in my mind. I greatly enjoyed your last, Charles wrote, went to the shelf and selected his copy of the Malakand Field Force. I must say I'm impressed by your work, and I've read the reviews. As I recall, The Spectator hailed it as a minor classic. And the prince has been praising it to everyone who will listen, he extended the book. Perhaps you will be good enough to autograph it for me. I should be delighted, Winston replied, taking out a pen. Given your heroism in the Sudan, can I consider it a great honor? He took out a pen and wrote swiftly in the book. Your courage is spoken of in high places, he said, and handed it back with high praise. Charles's right brow went up, and he regarded Winston curiously. He had not disclosed those events of his military life, not even to Kate. Where the devil had Winston Churchill heard of it? In India or Egypt, most likely from one of his former comrades. He sighed, reflecting that the army has always loved a rousing war story that exemplified the soldierly virtues of heroism, self-sacrifice, and all that rot. High places, eh? The remark might merely be Winston's posturing. The young man was certainly prone to dropping great names, and on any occasion where he thought it might earn him any kind of attention. But it was also remotely possible that the tale had come from His Royal Highness himself. who seemed to be of late to have taken an interest in Winston's career. The relationship between the prince and the Churchills was long and full of intrigue. It was no secret that Albert Edward had long been, and perhaps still was, one of Lady Randolph's many lovers. The late Lord Randolph, Randy to his friends, had winked at that adultery, but foolishly attempted to call the prince's hand on another, involving Randy's brother, Blandford, and one of the prince's former paramours, Countess Aylesford. Randy, the most self-destructive man Charles had ever known, tried to use some of His Royal Highness' indiscreet letters to force the prince to help Blandford. But this treachery only brought disgrace. It was a long time before Lord Randolph and his wife were allowed to rejoin the royal entourage. Charles sat down, lit his pipe, and leaned back in his chair. "And just what," he asked dryly, "have you heard about my Qa'Rajh?" Winston hesitated at his drafting a response designed not to give offence. "Well," he said carefully, "at the Battle of Abu Far, that would have been in 85, they say a certain lieutenant of engineers led his detachment in a forlorn hope against the dervishes' flank after they had broken through the regiment's square. The detachment was slaughtered except for the lieutenant, but his bravery saved the rest of the regiment." Then wonderingly, almost as if talking to himself, he added, "They say he refused the Victoria Cross." Charles drew on his pipe. He had heard from acquaintances close to Kitchener that Winston was considered a self-advertiser and publicity hound. One of Surdar's aides had even gone so far as to suggest to Charles that Winston, who had pulled every string he could reach for an assignment to the expeditionary force, had gone to the Sudan in search of campaign medals to further his political hopes back home. If that were true, Winston must ascribe Charles's refusal of a VC to sheer lunacy. But the point was not to be argued. Instead, Charles said mildly, "The Sudan campaign has certainly proved popular here. Most people say that Kitchener's army put a proper end to the business we should have finished 13 years ago." He paused. "You must have had an interesting time over at Omdurman." "Ah, Omdurman." Winston lost his diffidence, and his pale eyes lit as if by electricity. "The battle entirely strengthened my faith in our race and our blood. We may have appeared to those savages as barbarous aggressors, but I am proud to raise my sword and pen in honour of the persevering British who, though often affronted, usually get their way in the end." "Oh," Charles said. Both his eyebrows went up this time. "It's the game, you know," Winston said, leaning forward eagerly. "War is the finest, honestest work of every man. Omdurman proved to the world that the spirit which flamed in the Light Brigade at Balaclava still burns in the British cavalry of today. Such gallantry, such deeds of distinction." "Indeed," Charles murmured. He cleared his throat. "Well, if you take that line in your book, I dare say it shall sell very well, and undoubtedly raise you to any pinnacle you choose." "Thank you," Winston said. "I believe it is my duty to give the readers a taste of the fury of war." He put on a grim look that was at odds with his usefulness. "We were in a tight spot at Omdurman, you know. If it hadn't been for my Mauser pistol, my bone would have been bleaching in the Sudan." "The M96 self-loader?" Charles asked, reaching for another change of subject before they could soar to more lofty heights of rhetoric. "Yes, that one. You've used it." "I've had occasion to examine it," Charles said thoughtfully. He had in fact discovered a whole crate of this particular weapon, which was manufactured in Germany the year before. One weapon from that consignment had very nearly ended his investigation and his life. He did not elaborate because His Royal Highness had declared the matter secret in interest of national security, and Charles doubted that Winston could keep a confidence. "It is a fine defensive weapon," he said. "It must deliver a remarkable volume of firepower." Winston became quite animated. "Oh, yes. Not only does it fire as fast as you could squeeze the trigger, but with reloading is simplicity itself. The bolt locks open at the last shot, and you simply ram another clip of cartridges down into the magazine." He raised his hands and pointed his finger as if it were a gun. "And there you are, 10 more dead men." George turned from the fireside conversation. "Is it as accurate as they claim?" Rayburn looked up, the fire glinting in his glasses. "I understand," he said, "that the rear sight is adjustable to 100 yards. "Several hundred," Winston said. "I shall consider acquiring one," George said. "Where did you get yours?" "You might try Wesley Richards in New Bond Street." Charles rose from his chair. "Ah! Here are the ladies at last," he said, with relief.